The crisp Montana morning dawned, its cold air biting at the edges of the land, and the tall grasses shimmered with a dusting of frost that caught the light like scattered diamonds. The ancient pines, towering and solemn, whispered forgotten secrets in the wind. A place where time seemed to stand still, where the world outside was a frozen wilderness untouched by human hands, and where a quiet soul had lived a life devoted to the rescue and rehabilitation of wild creatures. Daphne Henkins was 73 years old. Her bones ached more these days, her movements slower, but there was no place she would rather be than here, at High Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, where she had spent the last 22 years of her life tending to injured or orphaned wildcats. The sanctuary, nestled at the foot of the Bridger Mountains, was her life's work, a labor of love and devotion to the animals that called Montana's rugged terrain home. Wrapped in a heavy wool coat, Daphne moved slowly along the perimeter of the sanctuary. Her walking stick, a sturdy companion on these morning walks, tapped rhythmically on the ground. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but she hardly noticed it. The solitude of the morning was something she cherished. The stillness, the quiet that seemed to breathe with the land itself. No matter how much the years weighed on her, this was her sanctuary, the place where she felt at peace, where she belonged. "Coffee's ready when you get back," called Miguel, her assistant of 15 years, from the warmth of the main cabin. Miguel was more than just a veterinary technician. Over the years, he had become her closest friend. Her right hand as age made the work more difficult. His concern for her was evident, but Daphne had never been one to take too kindly to fussing. She raised her walking stick in acknowledgement without turning around, preferring to keep to herself for now. The sanctuary was quiet at this hour, save for the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional cry of an owl. It was a familiar rhythm, a pattern she had lived by for decades, a rhythm she had come to rely on. Her life had been shaped by it, and it was a life she had chosen wholeheartedly. The sanctuary itself housed 12 permanent residents, bobcats, lynxes, and the occasional mountain lion that had been too injured to survive in the wild. Daphne also cared for several animals in various stages of rehabilitation. She paused at a clearing, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and looked out over the vast expanse of the valley below. The view always reminded her why she had chosen this life. It wasn't just about the animals, it was about the land, the wild, the sense of belonging she had felt the moment she stepped foot on this land all those years ago. The land stretched out before her, 500 acres of protected wilderness that served as a buffer against the encroaching development of the nearby town of Bozeman. Beyond the sanctuary, the jagged peaks of the Bridger Mountains stood tall, their snow-capped summits untouched by the warm breath of spring. As she stood there, lost in thought, memories began to flood her mind. She thought of the day she had first met a bobcat, a memory that had been seared into her heart since she was just 8 years old. She remembered how she had locked eyes with the creature at a small zoo outside Bozeman, how something inside her had shifted that day. She thought of the arguments with her parents when she was 22, when she had turned down a prestigious medical scholarship at Johns Hopkins University to dedicate her life to rescuing wildlife. Then there was David Black. She smiled at the thought of him. David had been her partner in every sense of the word, in work, in life, and in love. She remembered the first time she had met him at a conservation conference in Denver, how his passion for wildcats had matched her own. They had built High Ridge together, and for 17 years they had shared everything. Their dreams, their work, their life. But the accident had taken him from her. David's death had shattered her. The loss of him had left a void, one that had been almost impossible to fill. She had questioned everything after he was gone, wondering what the point of it all was. But the animals, they needed her. Slowly, over time, caring for them had begun to heal something inside her. Not completely. There would always be a David-shaped hole in her heart, but it was enough to keep going. A rustling in the underbrush interrupted her reverie, pulling her back to the present. She went still, instinctively scanning the tree line. Years of experience working with wild animals had taught her the value of patience and observation. For several long moments, nothing moved. Then a flicker of movement caught her eye. The tufted ears of a bobcat appeared briefly before disappearing back into the brush. Daphne smiled to herself. Bobcat sightings around the sanctuary weren't uncommon, but they always felt like a gift. The bobcats often patrolled the boundaries of the sanctuary, drawn by the scent of their captive counterparts or simply passing through on their territorial rounds. "Go well, friend," she murmured under her breath, her heart light as she turned to continue her walk along the familiar path. Little did she know, this particular sighting would be the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in her life, one that would defy everything she thought she knew about wild animals, memory, and the connections that bind them to humans. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine. Daphne finished her rounds, checked the enclosures, and made sure everything was in order at the sanctuary. Miguel had already started the coffee, and the aroma of freshly brewed beans filled the small cabin when she returned. The cabin, which served as both their living space and the sanctuary's headquarters, was warm and welcoming. It was a simple, rustic place, just like the life they led. Daphne shed her coat and boots before sitting down at the kitchen table, her hands grateful for the warmth of the coffee mug she cradled. She could hear the sounds of the sanctuary beginning to stir as Miguel worked on the medication charts, and Jessie, the education coordinator, prepared for the school group that was scheduled to arrive later that day. The sanctuary had long hosted educational programs, aiming to inspire a new generation to appreciate and protect the wildlife of Montana. "Any problems on the perimeter?" Miguel asked, glancing up from the chart he was working on. Daphne shook her head. "All quiet. Spotted a wild bobcat on the East Ridge, though." Miguel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Male or female?" "Didn't get a good look," Daphne replied, swirling the coffee in her mug absently. "Just saw the ears. Could have been anyone." Still, the sight of the bobcat had lingered in her mind, a feeling she couldn't shake. Something about the way it moved had felt vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. She dismissed the thought, chalking it up to her own nostalgia and the memory of CA, the bobcat they had raised so many years ago. Her thoughts drifted back to the days when CA had first arrived at High Ridge. She remembered the fragile little kitten that had been discovered by a logging crew, alone and terrified. David had been the one to drive out and collect the orphan cub, his deep voice filled with concern as he reassured Daphne that the tiny creature would make it, even if it didn't seem likely at first. "Look at this one," David had said, lifting the tiny bundle of fur. "He's a fighter." And fight he did. CA had been a survivor, even when all hope seemed lost. Daphne had never seen a wild animal like him. Though they took great care to ensure he remained wild, CA had always watched Daphne with an intensity she could never quite explain. It was as if he saw her, understood her, and somehow there had been an unspoken connection between them that even the most seasoned wildlife experts couldn't quite define. "Imprinted on you, you think?" Miguel had suggested after a few months of the kitten's recovery, but Daphne had shaken her head. No, he wasn't like that. He was too independent, too wild for that. But the bond was there, even if it was unacknowledged. And when it came time to release CA back into the wild, the goodbye had been harder than she expected. David had tried to comfort her, reminding her that CA was a wild animal and he needed to live as one. Daphne had watched as they opened the cage door in the remote area of Gallatin National Forest, and CA had hesitated before stepping out into the wild. His golden eyes had met hers one last time, a moment of acknowledgement, and then he was gone. David had reassured her, of course. "He's born to be wild. He'll be all right." Still, Daphne often wondered what became of CA and whether he was thriving in the wild, far from the sanctuary that had been his home. It was a thought that lingered in her mind, but life had continued on. Over the years, she had rescued and rehabilitated countless other animals, each one special in its own right, but none quite like CA. Miguel's voice brought her back to the present. "The school group will be here in an hour," he reminded her, and Marissa called. "The injured lynx they found near Yellowstone is stable enough for transport. She'll be bringing it in this afternoon." Daphne nodded. Her mind shifted to the new arrival. The work at the sanctuary never stopped, and neither did her dedication to the animals who needed her. "We'll make sure everything's ready," she said, standing up and smoothing down the front of her coat. As she moved toward the door, She felt the familiar twinge in her hip, a reminder of the fall she had taken 3 winters ago. Dr. Mitchell had insisted that she consider a hip replacement, but Daphne had no intention of going down that road just yet. The surgery would mean weeks away from the sanctuary, and she wasn't ready for that, not when there was so much work to do. The day passed in a flurry of activity. The school group arrived, full of excitement, their laughter ringing through the education center as Daphne and Jessie led them on a tour of the sanctuary. The children were fascinated by the animals, particularly Samson, an elderly bobcat with one eye who had been at the sanctuary for over a decade. He was one of their permanent residents, having been rescued from an illegal exotic pet situation. Despite his gruff exterior, the children were enchanted by him, pressing their noses against the glass to get a closer look. "Can we pet him?" one little girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Daphne smiled gently. "No, honey. Even though Samson has lived here a long time, he's still a wild animal. We don't touch them unless they need our help. That's how we show them respect." The children nodded solemnly, clearly understanding the lesson. Daphne felt a sense of pride as she watched them absorb the importance of wildlife conservation. These moments, these small victories, were what kept her going. She had spent her life protecting these creatures, and now she was passing that legacy on to the next generation. After the group left, Daphne retreated to her office to catch up on paperwork. Grant applications and financial reports were a constant reminder of the challenges that came with running a sanctuary, but she was used to the grind. It was part of the job, and she did it because it mattered. Just as she was about to lose herself in the paperwork, Miguel knocked on the door. "Marissa's here with the lynx," he said. "She's in pretty rough shape, hit by a car near the park entrance. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding." Daphne stood up quickly, her attention shifting. "Let's go. We'll do what we can." The injured lynx was brought in on a stretcher, her body limp and covered in blood. Dr. Ellie Chan, the veterinarian who came to the sanctuary twice a week, was already assessing the damage. The young female lynx had clearly suffered severe trauma, and Dr. Chan was concerned about the fractures in her hind leg and ribs. Daphne didn't hesitate. "Let's proceed with surgery," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was heavy. The hours that followed were tense as they worked to stabilize the lynx and repair the damage. By the time the procedure was over and the lynx was settled into a recovery enclosure, the day was fading into evening. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the sanctuary in a thick layer of white. Miguel insisted on making dinner, and the two of them ate in silence, exhausted from the long day. The world outside had turned into a winter wonderland, the snow falling thick and fast. It was beautiful, but the quiet was unsettling, a reminder that nature was still in charge here. After dinner, they checked on the lynx again. She was still unconscious, but her vital signs were stable. Daphne felt a sense of relief, but the exhaustion weighed on her. "I'll take first watch," Miguel offered, his tone gentle. "You get some sleep. I'll wake you at 2. Daphne nodded, too tired to argue. She made her way to her bedroom, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment before properly preparing for bed. But sleep was elusive. Her mind kept returning to the bobcat she had seen earlier, the one that had caught her attention with its unmistakable tufted ears. It was as if the creature had been calling to her, pulling her back to something long buried. As she lay there, the silence of the night settled over her, and she finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that the next few hours would bring something that would change her life forever. Daphne awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked rapidly, disoriented for a moment as the room around her took shape in the dim light. The clock by her bedside read 1:47 a.m., and the usual sounds of the night, the wind brushing against the window, the distant rustle of leaves, were silent. The only sound was the pounding of her own heart, an urgency she couldn't explain. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dark, and listened intently. There it was again, a scraping sound against the window. It was faint but distinct. Daphne froze, her instincts kicking in. She had dealt with the occasional nighttime visitor over the years. Bears, mountain lions, and other wildlife drawn to the scent of the animals in their care. But this sound was different. It wasn't the chaotic, unpredictable movements of a larger predator, but something careful, deliberate. A soft thump against the glass followed, and Daphne's breath caught in her throat. She slid her legs off the bed, her pulse quickening as she grabbed for the flashlight on her bedside table. The sanctuary's remote location meant that if an animal had gotten close to the cabin, it would be a rare event. The tall fences kept most of the large predators at bay, and the snow outside had made it even more unlikely for anything to make its way near the building. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain, pulling it back swiftly. The light from the flashlight flooded the night, catching a pair of gleaming eyes reflected back at her. They glowed in the darkness, sharp and unblinking, set in the face of a creature she knew all too well. A bobcat. But this wasn't just any bobcat. This one was larger than most, with a healthy build that suggested it was a strong, mature male. His distinctive tufted ears flicked toward the light without flinching, his gaze steady and unafraid. He didn't hiss or retreat like a wild animal would if startled. Instead, he simply sat there, staring back at her with a calm intensity. Daphne's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen in place, her mind racing. It was impossible. The bobcat's eyes were unmistakable, golden and intense, just like they had been all those years ago. It couldn't be. Her thoughts scrambled to catch up with her. Was it a coincidence? Maybe it was just another bobcat passing through the area, curious but ultimately uninterested in her. But the way it moved, the way it stared at her, there was something oddly familiar about it. The realization hit her like a wave, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Kay." The bobcat's ears twitched forward at the sound of his name, his gaze never wavering from hers. Daphne could hardly believe it, but she knew deep down that it was true. This was CA, the bobcat they had raised, the one they had released into the wild so many years ago. He had returned. She watched, transfixed, as the bobcat raised one of his paws and pressed it against the glass. It was a deliberate, measured movement, so intentional, so unlike the random, nervous behavior of a wild animal. The paw left a perfect print on the condensation that had formed on the window, and Daphne gasped aloud. "CA," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "You came back." The bobcat didn't respond verbally, but his gaze softened, almost as if he understood her words. His nose flared as he took in the scent of the air coming through the cracked window, and then he remained perfectly still, balanced on the narrow sill. The snowflakes outside swirled around him, but he seemed unbothered by the cold or the elements. He was focused solely on her. Daphne's hands trembled as she reached for the window's latch, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening, but she couldn't turn away either. With shaky hands, she carefully unlocked the window, lifting it a few inches to let in a gust of frigid air. The cold nipped at her skin, but she barely noticed it. Her attention was fixed on the bobcat before her, the one who had once been a small, helpless kitten who had fought to survive against the odds. He had come back to her, defying every natural instinct to avoid human contact. For a moment, Daphne hesitated. She had spent her life studying wild animals, understanding their behaviors, their instincts. Bobcats were solitary creatures, fiercely independent. They didn't seek out human companionship. They didn't return to places where they had once been nurtured. And yet, here was CA standing before her, breaking every rule. Her heart ached as she reached out slowly, extending her hand toward him. It was an instinctive gesture, an offering of connection, though she knew that she could never truly tame him. He was wild, always had been, always would be. Still, the bond they had shared all those years ago seemed to echo between them, a silent understanding that no amount of time could erase. The bobcat's gaze never left her, his intense yellow eyes locked on hers. Then, in a move that nearly stole her breath away, CA stepped forward, delicately lowering himself onto the sill, and moved closer to the window. He stepped inside. Daphne's heart skipped a beat as he entered the room, his movements fluid and controlled, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. It was utterly unnatural, and yet in that moment, it felt right. She stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat, as the wild creature moved through her room with careful curiosity. CA circled the room once, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, taking in the unfamiliar sense of human life. He wasn't afraid. There was no aggression, no hesitation, just a quiet, watchful presence. He moved past her dresser, where a framed photograph of Daphne and David, taken during CA's rehabilitation, rested on the surface. The photo showed the two of them smiling, standing proudly with CA in the background, the wild bobcat lurking just behind them. CA paused, his gaze fixing on the picture. Daphne's heart twisted painfully as she watched him study the image. The connection, the memory, was undeniable. He remembered. Not everything, maybe, but something. There was a recognition in his eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement. Daphne felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she slowly extended her hand toward him, palm open, as if inviting him to remember once more. CA looked at her hand, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Human and wild, bound by something neither could fully explain. Then, in a gesture that made Daphne's heart stop, CA stepped forward and pressed his forehead briefly to her palm. The touch was fleeting, but it shattered something deep inside her. A dam she hadn't realized she had built up over the years broke open. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to her knees, overcome by emotion. The wild bobcat had come back. He had remembered her, and he had come back. But after a few moments, CA lifted his head and stepped away, moving back to the window. He paused one last time to look at her over his shoulder. Their eyes met, and in that final moment, Daphne understood. This wasn't about affection or gratitude. It wasn't about taming a wild creature. It was about something deeper, something that connected them in ways words could never capture. Then, without another sound, CA turned and leapt back out the window, disappearing into the snow-covered night. Daphne stood, trembling, her heart heavy but full. She had always wondered if CA had remembered her, if he had found his place in the wild. Now she had her answer. He was out there, living the life he was meant to live. But he had not forgotten. He had returned. The wild had called him, and he had answered. The next morning, Daphne woke with a deep sense of exhaustion, the weight of the previous night's events still pressing on her chest. She felt like she had been holding her breath for hours, waiting for something monumental to happen, and now that it had, she wasn't sure how to process it. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind still swirling with the images of CA's visit, his presence so vividly burned into her memory. But when she looked at the window, there was nothing there. No trace of his visit. The snow had covered up the paw prints, and there were no more signs of him. Had it all been a dream? Her mind whispered the possibility, but the imprint of CA's paw on the glass was still fresh in her mind. Undeniable. It wasn't a dream. He had come back. The wild bobcat that Daphne had once saved, who had lived among humans for a time, had returned. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. CA, now an adult, healthy and strong, had defied every instinct, every rule about wild animals. They didn't seek out humans, not once they had been released into the wild. He shouldn't have come back. Yet he had. Miguel was already up and in the cabin when Daphne walked in, his back turned to her as he prepared breakfast. He hummed softly under his breath, lost in his work, but as soon as he saw her enter, his expression softened. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" Daphne didn't answer immediately. She simply sat down at the table and wrapped her hands around a warm mug of coffee that Miguel had already made. The warmth seeped into her bones, but her mind remained cold with confusion. What had happened last night? Why had CA come back after all these years? What had brought him to her cabin in the dead of night? "I saw him again," she said softly, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make it less real. Miguel looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "CA," she added, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. Miguel stopped what he was doing, a moment of silence hanging between them. Then he sat down across from her, his eyes gentle. "You mean the bobcat you released all those years ago?" he asked, his voice low, as though afraid to confirm the unbelievable. "Yes," Daphne replied, her eyes meeting his. "He came back, Miguel. Last night, right outside my window. I know it was him. I felt it. It's impossible, but I know it was him." Miguel remained silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. He had heard stories, of course, stories of animals returning to places where they had once known kindness, of extraordinary connections between humans and wild creatures. But never in his years working alongside Daphne had he heard of something like this. I don't know what to make of it, Daphne continued, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and confusion. It doesn't make sense. Wild bobcats don't do that. They don't seek out humans once they've been released. But he was there, Miguel. He came back. After all these years, and I don't know why. Miguel sat quietly, allowing her to process her thoughts. He knew how deeply Daphne had loved and cared for the animals in her sanctuary, especially CA. It was clear that the bond between them had been special, but for a wild animal to return after so long, it went against everything they knew about wildlife behavior. He didn't just come back to the sanctuary, he came to you, Miguel said quietly, his voice thoughtful. And he stayed, even though everything in him should have been telling him to run, to stay away from humans. Daphne nodded, her eyes distant as she recalled the moment. The way CA had placed his paw on the window, the deliberate gaze and the touch of his forehead against her hand. The connection between them felt like an unspoken promise, something that neither time nor distance could sever. Maybe it's more than just instinct. Maybe it's about something deeper, she said, her voice soft with wonder. I don't know what it means, Miguel, but it feels like something beyond the ordinary, something I can't explain. I've spent my whole life working with these animals, studying them, trying to understand their behavior. But this is different. Miguel nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. Maybe it's not meant to be explained. Maybe it's just something that happens. Something that's beyond science, beyond logic. You've always said the animals teach you more than you can learn from books, right? Daphne smiled faintly. You're right. They've taught me so much, and this feels like another lesson, even if I don't understand it yet. The conversation shifted as they began discussing the day's tasks. A school group was scheduled to visit in the afternoon, and there was the usual round of animal care to manage. But Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside her, a shift that had been quietly unfolding over the years. She had always loved the animals, had always cared for them with her whole heart. But now it felt like something else was calling her, something that went beyond her work, beyond the sanctuary. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The school group arrived as scheduled, full of questions and excitement about the wild creatures they had come to see. Daphne and Jesse led the tour, answering questions and explaining the sanctuary's work with passion and conviction. For a brief time, Daphne was able to focus on the children, their bright eyes full of curiosity as they asked about the different animals and the importance of protecting wildlife. But as the group left and the sun began to set, Daphne couldn't help but glance toward the eastern edge of the sanctuary, where the wild forest stretched out before her. Her thoughts wandered back to California. What had brought him back? What had driven him to seek out the place where he had once been cared for? She walked along the perimeter of the sanctuary, the cold air biting at her skin, but it was the memories that nipped at her heart. She had raised CA, taught him how to survive in the wild, and released him with the hope that he would live the life he was meant to live. And yet, despite all of that, he had returned. It wasn't just the physical return of the bobcat that troubled her. It was the deeper meaning behind it. Why had he sought her out? Why had he come back after so many years? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Miguel approaching, a strange expression on his face. I found something, he said, his voice serious. Daphne frowned. What is it? Miguel handed her a small piece of paper, a printout from the camera she had installed along the perimeter of the sanctuary. It was a photo, grainy but clear enough to make out the unmistakable form of a bobcat. California. The timestamp on the photo was recent. It showed CA at dawn, walking along the edge of the sanctuary property. He's been here all along, Miguel said, his voice soft but filled with wonder. At least once a week, always at dawn. Checking on the sanctuary. Checking on you. Daphne stared at the photo in disbelief. There, captured in the soft light of early morning, was CA, a wild, free bobcat, still keeping a distant connection to the place where he had once been saved. Why? Daphne whispered to herself. Why come back? Miguel placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. Maybe he's been checking on you too, Daphne. making sure you're okay. Daphne stared out at the snowy landscape, the wind whispering through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would. But somehow that was enough. The wild was still out there, still untamed, and California was part of it. He had returned not because he needed something from her, but because there was a bond, a silent, invisible thread that tied them together. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed to know. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of CA's visit lingered with Daphne like a lingering fragrance in the cold Montana air. Every time she stepped outside to do her rounds, she found herself looking toward the eastern edge of the sanctuary, hoping for a glimpse of the wild bobcat. But he remained elusive, never returning to the windowsill or venturing too close to the buildings. Yet the knowledge that he was out there, patrolling the boundaries of the sanctuary, brought Daphne a strange sense of comfort. The camera's photos had confirmed what she had hoped. CA was still there, regularly making his rounds, always at dawn. She often found herself standing at the edge of the sanctuary at that hour, peering out into the early morning mist, as if waiting for him to emerge from the shadows. Miguel had been kind enough not to press her about the encounter. He knew, like Daphne, that sometimes there were no answers to the mysteries the world threw their way. Sometimes a connection was just a connection, a bond that defied explanation and logic. And Daphne had learned over the years that some things were better left unspoken, left to exist quietly between the heart and the soul. It was one crisp morning in mid-April when she saw him again. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the sanctuary. The chill of the night had not yet fully retreated, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth. Daphne had just finished her morning rounds, checking the enclosures and ensuring that the animals were settled for the day. She had been lost in thought, reflecting on the changes in her life, when she heard the soft crunch of snow beneath paws. She turned slowly, and there he was, CA, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. He was watching her, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart flutter in her chest. The bobcat was every bit as magnificent as she remembered, his spotted coat a seamless blend with the surrounding wilderness, his tufted ears alert to every sound. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to stand still. The soft wind rustled through the branches, but the silence between them was deafening. Daphne's heart raced, her mind struggling to process the enormity of the moment. After everything, the years apart, the distance between them, he had returned again. This time, he didn't come closer. He remained at the edge of the sanctuary, just out of reach. His presence was like a reminder that the bond they shared was still there, still alive, even after all this time. Daphne slowly took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "I've missed you," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the quiet morning air. "I thought you might have forgotten." CA tilted his head, studying her for a long time, as if weighing her words. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped forward, his movements graceful and confident. He didn't come all the way to her, but his approach was enough. He had made the decision to acknowledge her presence, to allow the connection between them to continue. And in that moment, Daphne knew that he had not forgotten. Not the lessons they had shared, not the bond they had formed. Daphne stopped just a few feet from him, her heart in her throat. She reached her hand out, but CA didn't approach her hand. Instead, he stood still, his body tense with awareness. He looked at her with those sharp, steady eyes, and Daphne could see the wildness in him, the untamed spirit that she had always respected. But there was also something else, something deeper, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition. After a few moments, CA turned and began to retreat back into the woods, his figure disappearing into the underbrush as silently as he had come. Daphne stood there for a long time watching him go, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her. He hadn't needed to come all the way to her. He had simply needed to remind her that he was still out there, still living his life in the wild. And in some way, that was enough. The following days were filled with the usual routines, but Daphne found herself quieter than usual, her thoughts often drifting to the wild bobcat who had once been her charge, and who now moved freely through the forests of Montana. There were no more visits from CA after that morning, but she didn't feel a sense of loss. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was out there, thriving in the wilderness that had always been his home. His presence was a reminder of the delicate balance between wildness and care, between freedom and connection. The sanctuary continued to grow, and so did the bond Daphne had with the animals she cared for. There were new rescues, new lives to nurture, new stories to be written. But as the seasons shifted and the days began to lengthen, Daphne realized that the chapter of her life with CA had come to a close, at least in the way she had always imagined it. The Bobcat had not needed her anymore. He had learned everything he needed to know. He had lived the life he was meant to live, and that was the greatest gift she could have ever given him. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daphne sat outside the cabin with a cup of tea in her hands. The cool breeze tugged at her hair, but she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the life she had built, for the animals she had cared for, and for the extraordinary gift of having known CA. From the forest edge, a soft rustling caught her attention. She glanced up, expecting nothing more than a breeze, but this time she saw it, a flicker of movement among the trees, the tufted ears, the familiar golden eyes. CA was back, but this time he didn't stay at the edge of the sanctuary. He didn't retreat into the shadows of the forest. He stood there, watching her from a distance, as if acknowledging the full circle of their connection. And as she gazed back at him, Daphne knew with certainty that the bond they shared would never fade. It was timeless, unspoken, and deep. A bond that connected them in ways that went beyond the wild and the human, beyond the sanctuary and the wilderness. It was a bond that transcended everything. And as the last light of day disappeared behind the mountains, Daphne smiled to herself, feeling the peace that only a life lived in harmony with nature could bring. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, her voice carried away by the rustling of the trees, "for everything." And as the snow began to fall once more, Daphne knew that she had made a difference, not just in the lives of the animals she cared for, but in the life of one wild bobcat who had never forgotten the human kindness that had saved him. The bond was still there, always. As the days passed into the warmth of late spring, Daphne found herself at peace in a way she hadn't been in years. CA's return, brief but profound, had completed something for her, a circle she didn't even realize needed closing. There were no more visits, no more moments of uncertainty or longing. The wild bobcat had returned to the forest, just as wild and free as he had always been meant to be. Yet somehow, the knowledge that he was out there and that he had remembered filled her heart with an unexpected peace. There was something profound in the silence that followed. It wasn't just the absence of CA's physical presence. It was the understanding that the wild had its own rhythm, its own course, and sometimes that meant allowing creatures to roam free and independent of human intervention. She had done her part. She had given CA the chance to live the life he was meant to lead, and in return he had shown her that even the most fiercely independent of creatures could carry with them the memory of kindness, of connection. And in this, Daphne found the deepest lesson of all, that love, compassion, and care could transcend the boundaries of species, time, and circumstance. Sometimes the connections we share with others, human or animal, aren't always about what we do for them in the moment. Sometimes it's about giving them the space to become what they were meant to be and trusting that the bond you share will endure, even if it's not always visible. On a crisp morning in late June, as Daphne stood at the edge of the sanctuary, looking out over the valley and the thick forest beyond, a thought came to her, one that had been growing in her heart for some time. She had spent her life rescuing and rehabilitating wild creatures, teaching them how to survive, how to live freely in the wild. But in return, they had taught her too. They had taught her about resilience, about survival in the face of adversity, about patience and the quiet strength it took to wait for the right moment, about the way the wild in all its untamed beauty could find its way into a human heart and in turn, change that heart forever. She realized that the lesson from CA was not about the physical return of the bobcat. It wasn't about how he had come back to her cabin or left his paw print on the glass. The lesson was far more profound, that we are all part of something greater, that there are connections in this world, in the web of life, that defy logic, reason, or even explanation. Yet they are real. They are as real as the wild animals we care for, as real as the land that sustains them. As she stood there, Daphne felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. She had given much of her life to the animals, to the sanctuary, to the wild. But the wild had also given her something she could never have anticipated. It had given her a sense of purpose, a connection to something timeless, something larger than herself. And that, she realized, was a gift beyond measure. The birds sang in the distance, and the wind whispered through the trees. The land felt alive, vibrant, full of stories waiting to be written. Daphne took one last look at the sanctuary, at the animals she had cared for, and the ones still in her charge, and smiled. She had done her part. She had helped create a place of refuge for those who needed it, and in return, the wild had touched her soul in a way she could never have imagined. The sanctuary would continue on, as it always had, and so would she. But now, with a heart full of the lessons of the wild, she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the bond she shared with the creatures she cared for would always remain untamed, wild, and true. The lesson. The story of Daphne and CA is a reminder that life, in all its beauty and complexity, is about connection. These connections are not always understood or easily explained. Sometimes the greatest acts of love and care are not about holding on, but about letting go, giving space for someone or something to grow into who they are meant to be. It's about trusting that the seeds we plant, whether with people, animals, or even ourselves, will blossom in their own time. Daphne's journey with CA teaches us that wildness and compassion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often coexist in ways we may not expect. The bobcat, a creature of independence, showed that even the wildest among us can carry with them the memory of kindness, and that kindness can return in ways we least expect. This story also reminds us that we don't have to control every part of life. There is strength in stepping back, in allowing things to unfold in their own way. Sometimes the most powerful acts of love are those that are invisible, the ways we offer care, compassion, and protection without expecting anything in return. Ultimately, Daphne learned that the true power of love is in its ability to transcend all boundaries. It goes beyond ownership or control, beyond time or distance. It is a thread that connects us to the world around us, a bond that remains even when we can't see it. Just like the wild bobcat, the connections we share with others are often invisible, but they are enduring, shaping our lives in ways we may never fully understand.